Great. Thanks, Alyssa. Well, it's great to be back with you again this morning. My name is Stephanie Ertis, and I am MCASA's Associate Director. And I'm here with one of my former colleagues. Claire, do you want to say hi?
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for having me. And thank you, Alyssa, for your lovely introduction. My name is Claire Nickel. I am a former SALI Legal Advocate, and I'm excited to be here with you all.
Great. Thanks, Claire. So we are going to talk about money today. And as we get started, I am going to ask you all a question. So I want you to think about these questions. If your first name starts with the letters between A and F in the alphabet, I want you to contemplate what you would do with $200,000. Like if you had $200,000, what would you do with it? If your first name is G through N, starts with a letter in the alphabet G through N, what would you do with an extra $10,000 a year? If you had $10,000 at the end of every year, an additional $10,000, what would you do with it? And if your first name begins with a letter O through Z of the alphabet, what would you do if you had $850 extra a month? Like if you all of a sudden got an $850 a month raise, what would you do with this money? So what would you do with $200,000, with $10,000 extra a year, or with $850 extra a month? So start to put these in the chat. I'm going to go through some of our beginning slides to talk about our objectives and how we're going to frame up our workshop, but we're going to come back to this. So put in the chat, if you fall into these categories, what you would do with this money. So we are going to talk today about the economic empowerment of survivors. So the first thing that we're going to do is describe the economic cost of sexual assault for survivors. How much does it cost in money when someone is sexually assaulted? What does that mean to their personal finances? We're going to have you understand the role social and institutional inequalities play in a survivor's financial security. We're going to understand financial abuse and the tactics abusers use to impact a survivor's financial security. And then Claire's going to talk a little bit about developing strategies for discussing money with clients and developing strategies for cultivating financial stability and safety for clients that are facing economic challenges. So again, we want to remind you that we don't have all of the information about this, the Claire and I. So we want to invite you as well to participate and share your knowledge as you feel comfortable and safe doing that, and help us all learn together. So the way we're going to talk about this today is we're going to talk about the economic impact of social violence, and we have some poll and chat questions. We're going to talk about talking to survivors about money, and then you're going to learn a little bit more about the Sexual Assault Legal Institute. I know you've had some other sessions with folks from SALI, but this is really going to pertain specifically to the work they do around economic stability. So before we get started and before we go back to those questions about what you would do with the money if you had it, I do want to offer an enhanced trigger warning. So this topic may be totally new to you, even if you've been doing this work for a while. We don't often talk about money and survivors. And one of the reasons that we do this workshop in this foundational training is because at MCASA, we feel like this is so important to really address these issues of economic instability, because talking about money can be uncomfortable. And we're going to talk about how to make that more comfortable today and inform you with some information about why that's so important. So I do want to say, though this topic might be new to you, it might bring up some very strong emotional reactions, or the content could be triggering to you and make you, as an advocate or a survivor, angry, frustrated, or upset. So we encourage you to take care of yourself during those moments. If you have to step away from the slides in the webinar, you will get the slides in the recording so you can go back to it at your own pace as well. So let's go back to those initial questions for a second. So I'm going to open up my chat. So what would you do if you had $200,000 a year, $10,000 or $200,000 total, $10,000 a year, or $850 extra a month. So I'm gonna get close to my screen here and see what you all put in the chat. Um, so someone said they would put it into their savings or towards a car payment. Someone said they would save it to a CD, so they would invest some of that money and they put it towards their kids' college and their own retirement. Someone else said they would help their kids. We're getting people talking about investment, paying off student loans. Um, a lot of investment in savings, which is really good. Half would go to savings, and half would go to a mortgage. So using it to buy a house, absolutely. Um, Split between savings, loans, and investment. What a responsible group you are, paying off your debt and investing your money. I love it. Saving it for hard times. This is also like kind of discussions that I'm having in my personal life about savings and investment as well. So this is reflecting what I'm doing. Someone finally said they would save it and they would go on a family vacation. So that's great. All of these are great answers. There's no wrong answers. Put half in savings and the rest to take a really nice family vacation. Absolutely. Someone's talking about donating it, traveling. So these are all amazing answers. Saving, investing, buying a house, paying off student loans, using it to bring your family together in meaningful ways like vacation or helping out your kids. Those are all amazing ways that you would use this money. And so the reason I do this question is we're going to talk about how important money is and the money that survivors lose as being a result of as a result of a sexual assault is like life-changing money. So we want to hold this as we go through this presentation on like if we had extra money or if they had the money that they it's not even extra, it's money that they would have had if they hadn't been sexually assaulted. It's life-changing, both for an individual, but also for our communities. So we're going to do some poll questions here. So Alyssa's going to pop up our first poll question, and we're going to talk about how often money is a barrier for survivors that you have worked with. So if you've worked with survivors, how often is money a barrier for them as they start to pursue their own justice and their own healing? So is it every person? Is it most people? Is it every so often? So it's not always an issue. Is it rarely a barrier? Or maybe you don't know because you aren't talking about money with survivors, which is fine as well. That's why we're doing this um to talk about talking to survivors about money. So it looks like I'm gonna end the poll, but it looks like most individuals are really seeing money as a financial barrier for folks. So let me see if I can share those results. Um, so you'll see that more than 65% of the folks on the call today that answered this poll are talking about how most individuals working with survivors are seeing money as a barrier. So we have another poll question as well. So if money is not a barrier, why not? So if you are seeing, so for the very few people that talked about money not being a barrier, why is it not a barrier? Or is it always kind of a barrier? So are survivors in your community generally have what they need? Are all the services that survivors could need in your community no cost? Does money never come up in conversation? So if money is not a barrier, why not? So I'm seeing some results talking about the most of the services that survivors need are at no cost, which is great. We're seeing some answers talking about money just isn't coming up in conversations. It can be really awkward to talk about. But the most we're seeing is that money is always a barrier. Money is often a barrier. So this kind of sets our tone for the rest of the presentation about why money is important. It's important because it can really mean freedom and security and safety for our survivors. So many people do not realize how much of a barrier money can pose to a survivor of sexual assault. When someone chooses to commit sexual violence, that doesn't just leave physical and emotional wounds. It can affect every aspect of a survivor's life, including their financial stability. So, research has shown that the financial cost of being sexually abused or a sexual assault survivor is very high. So this research, so these numbers that you're seeing on the screen, this was conducted by the CDC. They contracted some mathematicians that are specialists in this kind of work about 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago is when this research was conducted. And they found that someone that survived rape or an attempted rape or sexual assault, they are estimated to lose about $122,000 over their lifetime. For someone who survives childhood sexual abuse, their cost is closer to $300,000. So they're looking more at $282,000. And nationally, the economic cost including healthcare, mental health care, productivity loss, impact on their higher education and childcare. So those are just some of the things, and we're going to go deeper into that. Like, what are these costs to these survivors? These costs also add up to society as a whole as well. If you combined all victims of sexual assault in the United States, the lifetime cost could be nearly 3.1 trillion for lost productivity, criminal justice interventions, and healthcare. That's about 234 billion in criminal justice costs, 1.2 million in medical costs, including physical and mental health, 1.6 trillion in lost productivity at work. This is the cost that we pay as a community when someone commits sexual violence. So think about what we as a society could do with $3.1 trillion. Or, like you did earlier, what someone could do with 100 to 300,000 more dollars in their lifetime. This is life-changing money. Like, this can make the difference between the car someone drives, the education someone gets, the house that they're on, the time they get to spend with or the house that they buy, the time that they get to spend with their family, if they're even able to buy a house or complete the education that they're looking for. So this is why we spend some time talking about this in this foundational training that we are doing for these couple of weeks. So let's talk a little bit about more about what these costs are. Before we go on to that, or while we're moving on to that slide, um, sometimes folks that are in these presentations with MCASA for Money Matters are like, they think that we have somehow made up this science. And what I can tell you is, like, I am not a mathematician. Like, this came from people that were PhD level mathematicians. Like, this was a scientific study. This was not something that other advocates or other coalitions made up. It came right out of the Center for Disease Control, like I said, about 9 years ago. So I'm hoping that maybe in the next 5 or so years, they'll revisit some of this data so that we can get updated figures. But these are the figures that we're kind of working with right now. And their research then also did some collecting on information on what the costs actually were. So we divided these into 5 different categories as we're looking at what are survivors actually kind of paying for or having their finances impacted by. So work, education, health, access, and kind of an other category. So sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace can have long-term economic impacts. So this can be lost or lowered wages. This can be someone getting fired or quitting. And you'll often have people that are experiencing sexual assault, whether it's work-related or not. They may quit their job with no notice, or they're not able to complete that job anymore, or they don't feel safe there. And so then they end up working in what we call underemployment. So they're getting paid less than they would have if they had stayed at the position, or if they had gotten a similar position, or they quit their job quickly and they take a job that might be lower paying because they still need income. So you'll see underemployment also as something that sexual assault survivors experience. They might have a loss of performance or work productivity, or loss of developmental or development opportunities. So they're not able to go to conferences, or they're not being selected for major projects that might advance their career. When we look at education, we might look at, if you're thinking about a sexual assault survivor that's assaulted in middle school or high school, or after in their education after that in high school and college or community college or another education that they're pursuing after high school. They could skip classes or withdraw from courses. They could drop out of school. They might have an incomplete college degree, so they just can't complete that college degree. They might transfer from one university to another, which can be costly, not only in finances, but it could cause them to lose college credits. So they might have to repeat credits, which also adds up as an expense for them. And it could just have a negative impact on their overall education goals. One of the things I already always like to point out here, because I spent a lot of time working in higher ed, is college debt is college debt. You have to pay it off. There is like no way to get out of it. Like bankruptcy and other ways, you have to pay back that college debt. Even if something happened to you, even if you switch schools, you still have to pay your debt to that first school. College debt does not go away. You have to pay for it. So if you leave without your degree, you still will owe that university for all of the time that you spent there. So if somebody leaves halfway through their degree or without finishing their degree, they're still going to owe a lot of money and then not have that degree to show for it to be able to advance their career. So you can imagine there are lots of health expenses, injuries, testing, medication for mental and physical illnesses or issues that may arise. And similar with access to things, they might need childcare for various things, including appointments for physical or mental health issues that they're working through. They may need childcare for court dates or when they have to meet with lawyers or police officers or other things related to a sexual assault case. They could have higher housing costs. And this at first may not make a lot of sense, but a sexual assault survivor, if they leave their lease, if they break a lease without disclosing that they were sexually assaulted or without the landlord knowing that there was a sexual assault, that landlord could put kind of a mark, like a bad mark on their record. And so then they're going to be paying higher costs if they go somewhere else, or they might have a poor tenant history, which could result in higher costs or credit issues. This could also impact their transportation. Like, what if they're moving further away from some place or a place of employment or a place of education? So there are some access things that may happen. I do like to say here as well that our Sexual Assault Legal Institute, and we may talk about this a little bit later, they can help a sexual assault survivor break a lease without any penalties. Like Maryland law does protect that. But if a survivor doesn't know that and they just leave their residence, then that could have some financial repercussions. The other category has a couple different things. They may incur some debt because of a sexual assault. They may end up with poor credit if they can't pay their bills. They may have moving expenses, property damage, legal fees. As you learned earlier, the Sexual Assault Legal Institute is free, but there may be some legal fees that they would incur that they might not even be thinking of. Like maybe they need transportation to the courthouse. And some of that maybe they would get reimbursed, but maybe not. And if they are getting reimbursed, that means they have to have the money up front as well. So one of the things that I always kind of like to bring up in this other category when we are talking about it is you might be thinking like what debt would a sexual assault survivor like incur? For each assault it would be different, but one of the things I saw happening is if I worked with student sexual assault survivors, so if they were sexually assaulted in their own residence hall, sometimes as evidence they would take all of their bedding, their sheets, their pillows, their pillowcases, their comforter. They were never going to see that again. So if you think about your bed at home and how much it would cost to revamp all of that, to get new sheets, to get new comforter, to get new pillows, that's a little bit of money. And so, I don't know if folks know this, if you have a student that went to school or you went to school and lived in a residence halls beds are a different size than like regular beds. So it's like special sheets, special comforters. So that's going to cost someone. So right away, they might be incurring debt because they need they need a safe place, a place they feel safe and comfortable sleeping. And so that's just a small example of where they might end up going into debt, especially if they don't tell their parents or they haven't talked to anyone else. Often survivors that are sexually assaulted in their own space, even they don't want that stuff anymore either. They would want to get rid of all of that stuff and start over anyway. The school that I worked at offered financial assistance students to students that experienced this and needed to get new bedding. And we were able to really seamlessly be able to get them the finances that they needed to do that at no cost to them. But not every student would have something like that available to them. So, one of the things that I think is really important is to hear from survivors about what their experience is. So, this is a nice video. It's a couple minutes long, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and it talks about us in survivors' own words what their experience was in the workplace after they were sexually assaulted. So, we're going to hear from them now.
It actually was hard to actually just get a job. It's hard to, go out there and sell yourself and say, I'm a great, I'm a great hard worker, because people will be like, well, I haven't even been working for 2 years. And then, you can't actually say, well, that's because I was raped in 2008.
There was also about a 3-year period when I just felt absolutely exhausted. I found it very difficult to get out of bed. I found it very difficult to get on with my life. And I didn't want often to be out in the world.
So my career took a complete left turn, or right turn, I'm not sure. But my turn, let's start that over again. My career took a complete turn as a result of the rape. I mean, prior to that, I was actually a film producer, and I'd been working, pretty busy, active life for a small film production company, and it was exciting stuff. We were shortlisted for the Oscars. I went to the Oscars. The post-traumatic stress disorder, the anxiety, the depression, the complete lack of energy I had after the assaults totally robbed me of my ability to work as effectively. So I had to leave my job.
The amount of brain space that getting out of bed in the morning, getting clothes on, doing the day-to-day of life suddenly became completely impossible.
It was actually years before I was able to work again. I wasn't able to go back to the previous job. I wasn't able to find a job afterwards.
I ended up quitting without having anywhere to go in terms of a job. And just, it was just very difficult to deal with those things at the same time. I was trying to phone various people, organisations like Women's Aid and Rape Crisis, sort of because I didn't want to do that at home, because I was still with my ex. I'd be doing that sort of like in meetings room, trying to be as quiet as possible. I'd be going to the toilets and crying and that kind of thing and trying to hide it.
I call that year my zombie year, because I was pretty much a zombie.
And of course this had an effect on my career. When once I'd been very energetic and very driven, I found it much harder to get the kind of energy that I needed to go forward and to make work.
It's not just that you're crying all the time. You're crying all the time because you don't have a career, and because you literally feel like you're devoid of your own personality as a result of the assault. And it affects the way you trust people in your relationships, and because your career is affected, it affects your finances, which can then have a massive impact, 5-10 years later, because you can't buy property.
At the moment, we're seeing a way of talking about mental health in the workplace where it's starting to become allowed to be able to talk about depression, but coming out and disclosing to your employer that you've been the victim of a sexual trauma is still full of taboo and stigmatized. And the number of women who have told me that they have lost their jobs as a result of disclosing it's just mind-boggling, and it's not right.
So we also want to talk about, we spend some time talking about the cost of healing services and justice services, but we also want to talk about victims of financial abuse, where they have been given less access, or they have less access to money or economic stabilities because someone is taking advantage of them, usually in an abusive relationship. So financial and economic abuse occur when an abuser controls their victim's access to shared or individual assets. So they might conceal information from them or limit their current or future earning potential. It's one of the most powerful methods of keeping a survivor trapped in an abusive relationship, and deeply diminishes the survivor's ability to stay safe after leaving a situation. So research indicates that financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. And we know that intimate partner sexual violence is very common in domestic violence. And 75% of women in domestic violence shelters reported experiencing at least one act of intimate partner sexual violence during the past year. There's not research available on men who experience domestic violence or non-binary and transgender folks who experience domestic violence and their sexual assault rates. That is not available, but more research is being done every day. So when we know that, we will add that into this PowerPoint as well. So surveys of survivors reflect that concerns over their ability to provide financially for themselves and their family is one of the top reasons for staying or returning to an abusive partner. So even more than physical or sexual abuse, it might be the financial abuse that is affecting them more and causing them more of a barrier in leaving. So we wanted to talk about a couple of different forms of abuse. So you'll see on the PowerPoint slide, employment-related abuse. So this could be preventing the survivor from attending, from going to their actual job. It could be demanding that they quit their job. It could be preventing them from looking for a job or attending job interviews, causing the survivor to lose their job by physically harming them in a way that would be noticeable at their job, harassing them at their job, and trying to sabotage their current work, or forbidding them from attending any training or advancement opportunities. So we talked about how sexual assault might limit someone's ability to have professional development at their work, to take advantage of that. And that could be coming from an abusive partner as well, where they're forbidding them to travel or work extra hours on a project that they might be interested in, or work at a different location that might be further from their home in order to advance their career. So coerced debt is also a form that we see of financial abuse. So this could be applying for credit cards or obtaining loans in the survivor's name without them knowing it, or forcing the victim to obtain loans without them wanting to do that, forcing them to sign financial documents, using threat or force to convince the survivor to make credit-related transactions that they're not comfortable with making, filing fraudulent taxes, filing false insurance claims. There are lots of ways that an abuser can put a survivor in debt without them knowing or without their permission. One of the other ways we see financial abuse happening is limiting access to information about finances. So preventing them from having access to records or documents or financial information, not including them in investment or banking decisions, withholding funds from the survivor or the children that they would use to obtain basic needs, as far as like food or medicine, and refusing to pay or evading child abuse or child support, or manipulating the divorce process by drawing it out and hiding or not disclosing assets. So this is a way of withholding information that can harm the survivor. And there are lots of other forms of economic abuse. A couple of them that we like to point out is demanding that a lease or mortgage or assets be just in the abuser's name. When I did direct service work, I saw this often with cars. Like the car that the survivor drove was actually in the abuser's name. So if the survivor left with that car, the abuser could claim that the car was stolen, that it was their car and not the other person's car. Now, I will say in incidences where that happened, it did not work for the abuser. Like the police or the judges would understand what was going on and the abuse of the financial abuse that was happening, but that still could happen where someone could claim their car was stolen because your car is in their name. Or they could stop paying the car payments and the car gets taken away because the car is in their name and you didn't know they weren't making the payments, or the survivor didn't know they weren't making the payments. Forcing a survivor to give the abuser money or ATM cards or credit cards. We've seen that as well. And deciding when and how the survivor can access or use cash, bank accounts, credit cards, or access other things. We've seen this as well. Sometimes it's called like an allowance, like the survivor gets an allowance, and that allowance can be taken away from that person if they don't do what the abuser says. So I know many of you have worked with survivors, or maybe you are a survivor. So I want to give you all a chance to put in the chat as you feel comfortable. Please don't put anything that would make you feel uncomfortable. But what have you seen? What examples of financial abuse have you seen when you've been working with survivors? So put those in the chat. I have one more slide before, or two more slides before I'm going to transition it to Claire. But I want to come back to this question as well. So while you are thinking about what forms of financial abuse you have seen and put them in the chat, I do want to talk a little bit about economic disparities and underserved populations. So as we wrap up this first section, we want to end with this very important topic. So inequities that contribute to economic disparities for underserved populations. So this is the BIPOC community, disabled folks, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, and others that experience oppression in our society face greater financial hardships. The prevalence of sexual assault increases dramatically as annual household income decreases, and survivors with marginalized identities often fall through the cracks when seeking support services and do not get the support that they need. Underserved populations already experience barriers to economic attainment without adding the extra layer of survivorship. So some examples are the wage gap affecting women, and especially women of color. So job fields with more women are typically lower paid. Mass incarceration and gentrification, redlining, all affect people of color. Redlining is denying various services or goods like loans or mortgages by federal or local or private agencies, which either directly or through the selective raising of prices deny people of color access to housing. The school to prison pipeline affects people of color. Workplace and school harassment can affect the LGBTQ community, and that can affect their access to finances. Research has found strong associations between food and housing insecurity and intimate partner and sexual violence. The LGBTQ plus youth, sorry, I stumbled on that, may experience homelessness at higher rates, which could also impact their financial security. So people from underserved populations experience so many barriers to economic securities already, and then simultaneously being more at risk for being victims of sexual assault in their lifetime can be insurmountable for some folks when it comes to their financial security. So all of these layers of trauma, violence, and oppression intersect at this area of economic insecurity. This is why this training is so important, to continue exploring new ways to serve survivors who are experiencing injustice and stress from so many different places, including financial stability. So let's talk about, let me see if I can get my chat open. So here are some great examples that you all put in the chat about what you've seen as it relates to financial abuse. So withholding finances from the survivor, making them sign those payments over to the abuser, absolutely. Draining bank accounts without the survivor knowing, using victim information to apply for credit cards, absolutely. Someone put in here that most survivors leave with absolutely nothing. That's very common, where they kind of have the clothes on their back if they leave a situation. And so they might not even have the information they would need to access any of their finances. Car insurance being canceled, absolutely. That is definitely financial abuse. Quitting a job so in order to report no income to child support to avoid paying alimony in a divorce. Yes, that's an absolute way to manipulate the system. Parents controlling bank accounts through adulthood, being raised by toxic parents and not realizing that this isn't normal. So this could also be something that they don't realize or recognize as abuse. Absolutely great answers to that question. So my last slide for my section, comes from the California Coalition, now called Valor US. And this is from their 2017 guide on the intersectional approach to ending sexual violence. And this is an insightful quote about economic justice. So I like to read it out loud because I like us to really hear some of these parts of what survivors face when it comes to money. This is a really good summation. So the economic burden for survivors of sexual assault is very real. Women at the margins are the ones who bear the brunt of the harshest realities, including sexual violence, and they do so with the least resources. The most vulnerable communities facing poverty and economic hardship, as well as sexual violence, are dealing with the compounding and layering of burdens that impact basic needs, their ability to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves and their families. Services need to provide the comprehensive and flexible support that these survivors need. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Claire to do some skill building and some talking individually about what you're going to be doing with survivors. So Claire, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for your input in the chat as well. From my experience, that can make all of these trainings that much more valuable. So I appreciate all of your engagement. Like Steph mentioned, next we're going to discuss kind of starting the conversation about economic safety, advocacy, and independence. Before we explore the steps within this conversation and different methods for navigating those steps, I just wanted to acknowledge that, like many other aspects of our work, these conversations are not one size fits all. In order to have a conversation that is actually worthwhile for our clients and truly provides supportive guidance and builds on their strengths, we have to acknowledge what sort of things may impact their current financial state and what they may be looking for from us specifically. So this includes things like recognizing that there are a wide range of circumstances, needs, and goals, and acknowledging that just because we perceive something as urgent does not mean that that's a priority for the survivor. So considering their safety is integral to effective advocacy in general, and it especially remains integral to ensuring effective economic advocacy as well. So we want to remember that each client may react differently to the conversation and they may need something different from you as their advocate as well. So before we kind of get started with the basic foundation of this conversation, I like to present 3 different client scenarios and ask that you all consider how the needs and priorities of each client may differ from one another, just as I kind of walk through the details of each of them. So first, imagine we have client 1. They have no concerns about economic safety planning and do not wish to discuss any assistance relating to their financial state. They find it insulting that we would initiate the conversation and are adamant that they are completely comfortable financially and do not want or need our help in that area. Next, we have client 2. They identify their experience as economic abuse. They explain that they've been forced to sign financial documents without understanding what they were, and their abusive partner has control of all of their earned wages from the last 2 years. They have shared assets, although they're not sure if their name is included in anything, and they have children in common. They're not interested in pursuing anything involving criminal law, but are interested in exploring options to increase economic and physical safety, as well as potential family law options. And then client 3, they have just physically left the home that they shared with an abusive party. They may have poor or no credit and are trying to begin saving money, but they're unsure where to start. They do not use the terms economic or financial abuse to label their experiences, but would like to discuss options to assess their current financial state, to increase their financial safety, and to discuss family law options that might be available to them. Their current employment options are limited due to immigration status, and they're unsure how to navigate risks after the abusive party previously threatened to use their immigration status against them. For me, envisioning client experiences and client scenarios prevents a tangible way to display how wide of a variety of circumstances we may be presented when we're exploring economic safety with clients. In our line of work, it is an inherent truth that we will inevitably interact with a wide array of survivor experiences, their values, and even unique perspectives on money and what those priorities may look like. So, as always, we just want to be prepared to handle these and any other situations in an appropriate, client-focused, and trauma-informed way. Ultimately, even if we think we have the answer for a client, we need to remember that our job is to restore this person's agency over their own life, empower them to voice their needs and wants, and provide our knowledge and skills simply to assist them in reaching the goals and priorities that they have set for themselves. So, the first step in this conversation generally looks like an initial screening. So, kind of to begin the screening stage, you want to start by just collecting information. Now, not all screening questions will look the same across different agencies. So, as we continue exploring kind of the stages of this conversation, you'll notice that I outline some logistics to consider, specifically within your current intake process or client conversations. I find it can be helpful to kind of consider these things before you're in conversations with clients, but also it's an ongoing learning experience, which is completely okay. In addition to kind of being present during the conversation with a client, I find it's helpful just to kind of be mindful of what feels right and natural when you're talking to them versus what feels maybe like it's being rushed or forced in these conversations so that you can make adjustments moving forward just to refine how these practices take place within your specific role. And before we kind of explore what questions can be asked to gather this information, as an advocate, you need to know why you're asking these questions. So, just kind of considering how is this relevant to your work? How can you use this information and work with this client to increase their safety, work to alleviate their concerns, things like that? And then, where does this appropriately fit in your current process? Obviously, there are a lot of reasons why someone might feel uncomfortable talking about their finances. So, to me, I consider it to be a really important aspect of this process to make it feel natural and as seamless as possible. Some suggestions I have, at least for this stage, is structuring this conversation to center around survivors. The goal ultimately is to understand their current financial situation and what their concerns look like, what the priorities are in addressing those concerns, and anything else that they specifically want us to know because they feel like it's important. It can also be really difficult not to let our own perspective of what needs to be addressed here influence the questions we ask. But just because something stands out to us doesn't mean that that's a priority for the client. So, some examples and just like best practice that I've found in my work with survivors is incorporating open-ended questions. For me, I've seen that this allows for the client to choose what they share with us. And that can be, sharing just a little bit at the beginning to kind of gauge if this is a comfortable space for them, what they may be able to benefit from as a result of this conversation, and just kind of also inform how we navigate continuing this conversation. And then also making sure to center questions around the impact of the current situation on the client and focusing on clarifying their goals and priorities when we're discussing those things further. So, specifically, these questions can include things like, how is your situation with money impacting your safety? What are your biggest worries regarding money? Do you have any concerns about your financial situation impacting your access to safe housing or stable income or employment at the moment? And do you have any financial concerns about your credit, identity theft, or any other matters? All right. So the next step is continuing this conversation. And this means going beyond the initial information gathering. So this is another stage where it's important to kind of logistically assess where this conversation appropriately fits into your interactions with a client. This may need to be separate from an initial intake, but there also may be urgent questions that you want to ask during that initial conversation and explore further later on. Generally, just finding what makes the most sense in the context of your organization is how this is going to feel most natural, both for you as an advocate and for the survivors that you're speaking with. Ultimately, the goal of this stage is building context. So we're aiming to build an understanding of where this client is coming from, what factors impact their outlook, what risks, strengths, and skills we should be considering, and what existing values the client might have pertaining to money. And all of those things are things that provide critical insight to this client's values when it comes to money and how kind of their personal experiences may impact where they feel comfortable or uncomfortable moving forward. And all of these things also just give us an understanding of how people have helped and harmed this person using their finances, so that as advocates, we can be mindful of that, maybe be maybe build some protective factors if that's what the survivor is looking for, and just generally cultivate a trusting dynamic within our agencies. So, some examples of specific questions we can ask during this stage is what is important to you when it comes to money and why? Just generally prompting, can you tell me more about your financial situation? Exploring what a survivor learned about money growing up and how that impacts how they manage their money or approach finances now. Asking when they have experienced financial hardship in the past, maybe what they've done during those times, what worked for them, if they would try those things again, what their strengths are when it comes to money, and who has hurt them in terms of their financial situation, and who has helped them, and how those people have done that. So, before we move on to more of an outline of how we can move forward with that information that we gathered, um, I wanted to take a moment just to kind of check in and see if you have any questions about how to approach starting the conversation with survivors. And if you have any concerns about how and where this may logistically fit into your intake process, or also just any thoughts or ideas that came up during this discussion that you would like to share with the group. As always, you can send things in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can unmute, whatever works for you. I'll just give a minute just to kind of serve as a checkpoint, and I'll keep an eye on the chat just to see if anything comes up. So I saw a couple messages that were sent. This absolutely is a very delicate experience for survivors. And like I said, a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about this. And I mean, I think a lot of us have experienced that in a variety of conversations in this field. But specifically, I think that this conversation is unique because people are uncomfortable talking about money, period, in our society. So, kind of bridging that gap in a process that can already feel like it's invasive or feel uncomfortable also needs to be given that consideration as well. And yes, social disparities are a big part of treatment plans. That's great. I'm glad to hear that you're taking that into consideration in your current practices and considering how that tailors specific resources to survivors as well. Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk more about that. Just for folks, if you're not looking in the chat, this person mentioned that they work in an inpatient substance use facility. So most of the people they work with need help with finances and learning how to budget or find resources. And those are things that we'll definitely talk about later in our presentation as well. Just kind of about like how we can look into community resources and things like that. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Continuity on care and who is working with the survivor is absolutely important, and it does allow for greater connection on more sensitive things. And we'll kind of talk about how having these conversations and offering your knowledge and skills as a resource as it pertains to finances kind of allows an addressing of an integral part of experiencing survivorship, um, but also allows you to serve as a trusted resource in warm handoffs to other community resources or a warm handoff to legal resources if that's something that is necessary for the client to reach their goals as well. Um, I think having these conversations and playing an active role in connecting clients directly and fostering relationships with other advocacy organizations or other service providers in the area is really, really impactful. Awesome. Thank you all so much for engaging with that. All of your input has been fantastic. We will move on. Thank you. So next, we will be kind of exploring the practices associated with financial or economic safety planning. So some of those more action-oriented steps. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to take a second to revisit the basic definition of safety planning for a minute. I'm sure this is something that you're all very familiar with, but I just wanted to note the important things about this definition to me are the fact that it's individualized, it's developed in partnership, and it addresses the unique needs and circumstances of individual survivors. We, just as a general rule, like we cannot guarantee safety in any scenario. And often we're collaborating on these safety plans because a survivor is in an inherently unsafe environment. However, the goal for us as advocates is always to work with the client to work towards becoming more safe. So in economic safety planning, these goals and principles remain the same. We're just centering that entire conversation around finances and around that economic empowerment. So this can, of course, be developed as a facet of a more general and overarching safety plan if that's something that your organization is already engaging in. And that is kind of one of those considerations that I mentioned in terms of figuring out where this fits in best for you as an advocate. So now the goal in economic safety planning is fairly simple. We're working towards becoming economically safer by offering knowledge and tools to support a survivor's ability to work towards their own safety and prioritize the concerns and precautions that are most critical to them, and ultimately restoring that survivor's sense of agency and control over their financial independence. So, for those goals to be achieved, an economic safety plan should address a wide range of safety needs for the survivor, work to reduce this survivor's economic risks based on their values, their goals, priorities, and strengths, and also focus on increasing a survivor's self-determination. So before we can create a safety plan with a client, we need to understand the risks that they're experiencing or those that just generally apply to their situation. So we want to discuss what risks you can identify from the information that they've provided you so far and explore what of those risks feels accurate or inaccurate to the survivor. So these should include things like risks associated with the abusive party, whether those are physical, psychological, sexual, economic. They may pertain to access to medical care, property, children, or they may involve like threats to the safety of children. But we also want to explore general life risks that apply to survivors. So those can involve things like experiencing any type of ism, living in poverty, navigating mental health challenges, employment obstacles, substance use or abuse, education, disability status, immigration status, and addressing with the survivor which of these risks feel the most important and which feel the most present in their situation. Additionally, we also want to address fears and priorities that the client may have. As you all and I previously mentioned, this is an uncomfortable space. So, having a natural conversation about what scares them or what they're nervous about this process and considering, can we alleviate that fear in any way while we're maintaining their safety? Is there something that we're proposing that is maybe not a safe option for this person? And we want to make sure that their priorities are clear. We can always confirm that what we understand still feels accurate to the survivor, and that's regardless of where we are in this process. This can and honestly should be an ongoing conversation where you're able to just check in and make sure that you all are on the same page and that they're still feeling like this safety plan or the course of this safety plan is working to address what feels most present for them. And then we also want to discuss resources. So, identifying what resources are available to the survivor, whether those are economic, whether those are housing based or community based, and then also what resources they have in themselves. So, what skills have we talked about? How can these skills be used to increase safety? What strengths do they have? And how can we use those to build resources? And then also what options we have already ruled out in previous conversations. And I just wanted to provide some examples of things that you can explore in terms of personal and community resources. So, personal resources could be things like skills that might create opportunity, strengths that may help build resources, and then any methods that they've used previously that worked well for them. And then community resources can be things like resources available for storage or housing or general support and partnerships that they're able to build in their community. And then just a quick note before moving on to the steps in safety planning that are more action oriented. I wanted to include a reminder that even though our intention here is to increase safety, um, they these steps are not always safe. The safety of each of these options needs to be assessed on an individual basis, and that should be during the conversation of risks and safety and continuously discussed throughout the development and execution of a client safety plan. At the end of the day, if the client does not feel like it's safe, then it's not safe. We can't make that determination for them, and we need to be able to work within the safety of their situation and really adapt to what their needs look like. So, we are going to discuss just some steps towards safety within a few different categories, but the first is going to be surrounding bank accounts. So, we should be creating an individualized safety plan just regarding financial safety and security. And for bank accounts, this may mean closing any joint bank accounts shared with an abusive party, securing your existing bank accounts by changing passwords or changing PIN numbers, changing passwords on your phone and other devices or other accounts, being sure that we know how to access accounts if an individual is locked out of them, and creating new bank accounts if that's something that's necessary for the client. We also want to be sure to address safety as it relates to financial documents. So, if possible, obviously, we would want financial documents to be gathered and put in a safe place. But this also means considering if an abusive party may be in possession of those documents, and assessing whether or not it's safe to gather the documents or make copies. Um, if the client is able to collect those documents, being sure to collaborate on a safe location for them to be stored. We also, in that, want to be sure that this is not only a location safe from an abusive party, but also just a generally safe place for financial information to be stored. And of course, that's if that's possible. That may not be possible for them, in which case we'll talk about, what the best option looks like for them, what the safest option looks like for them. And the client may also be looking for information on what that means. Like, what does it mean for a place to be safe to store financial information? What does that look like? Um, and then also, if there are any missing documents or any documents that the survivor is not able to get a copy of or to retrieve the original copy of, this can be a good place to start to offer tools and information about how to replace those documents. And then another thing that is important to focus on is savings. So this is, of course, if access to financial resources is a concern. We would want to start discussing potential ways that a client might be able to start saving money. So, discussing what ways they might be able to start saving even the smallest amount in a safe place. And that may not mean, allocating a portion of your standard paycheck. It may mean utilizing some of those personal skills to, begin offering childcare services or something like that, and navigating the risks and safety and revisiting just some of the concerns that the survivor may have mentioned in earlier discussions. This will obviously look different based on the other person's level of access to the survivor and the other risks that apply to their individual circumstances. So, this is a great place to start getting creative with advocacy and getting creative with brainstorming with the client and taking advantage of some of the strengths and skills that you all explored in previous discussions as well. And then also, again, just discussing what a safe place to store those savings may look like for them. For some people, this may not mean any formal financial institution or banking institution. It may look like a friend or a family member or just a general location that they feel comfortable storing their savings. Um, and just developing a plan if there is a risk that the savings may be discovered by the other person, um, whether that's the abusive party or anyone else who may present a safety or security concern for this person. Another crucial aspect of financial safety planning is generally addressing the survivor's cost of living and basic needs. Again, all of these options are only if the survivor feels like that's something they want to explore. In this case, you have the opportunity to create just a cost of living plan that the client can stick to, and that will help them meet their basic needs. And we want that plan to be realistic and meeting the true needs of a client. Everyone's priorities and needs look different, and this budget or plan is really only helpful if you're able to have an honest conversation with the survivor to ensure that all of their needs are being considered. And also, if they do currently live with the abuser, it can be helpful to make two budgets or two cost of living plans. One for expenses while living with that person, and one for living independently. That way, if that circumstance does change for some reason, that person doesn't feel like they don't have a plan. It gives them, security and knowing that if that doesn't happen, we have a plan that they're working on right now, and that plan is addressing all of their needs. But if something were to happen, we're prepared for that. And then this is also another place where it is incredibly helpful to loop back to what resources this person may have access to and which resources they feel safe and comfortable using. So we can consider and provide information for community resources that could assist in meeting some of the client's needs. Of course, ideally, that would be without additional expense for the client. And then also we can consider safe relationships, whether those are friends or family, whoever that may be for the person, that may be able to provide additional assistance or support. And we can explore if the client is comfortable with that. And if they're not, that's completely okay too. We can figure out, can we work with them to make them more comfortable, or can we navigate alternative solutions and options? And then lastly, we just want to discuss any additional precautions that may be relevant to the client situation. So we want to explore these options and determine the relevant additional steps based on their needs, but they can generally include things like opening a credit line to use in emergencies, or reviewing, assessing, and monitoring credit reports for suspicious activity. Discussing generally the risks associated with credit checks through landlords, banking institutions if they're taking out loans, disputing coerced or unknown charges and accounts, or disputing identity theft charges or accounts. One note for identity theft is that can require a report to law enforcement or to the IRS. So that can be an important point just to discuss with the client if that's something that they feel safe and comfortable with, or if that may not be an option that they're comfortable with at the moment. And then also, sometimes these conversations may include the client wanting to speak to an attorney. Those can be for things like legal remedies to economic or safety or any other concern that they may have. And those can include things like protective orders, divorce, custody, criminal proceedings, immigration law options, employment law options. We will, of course, provide SALI's information at the end of this presentation as well. But just as a general rule of thumb, if your agency doesn't have attorneys in office, it can be beneficial to consider fostering a relationship with other legal organizations in the community, just so that there's an opportunity for warm handoffs to explore legal options if a client does decide that they're interested in doing so. And if there's something that you can't come to a solution on how to address or mitigate, collaborating with other advocates and attorneys is always a great option. Just kind of getting creative and see what you all can come up with. The advocates in our area, in our communities, they're incredible advocates, and they've worked with an entire population of survivors that you may not have experience with, or they may have dealt with an extremely similar situation. So having the opportunity and putting in the effort to fostering those relationships can help all of you grow as advocates. I know it's helped me grow as an advocate, learning from the people around me. So that's always an option. And just as a note for here as well, having an ongoing conversation just to make sure that that safety plan is still relevant and working for the survivor, and that at any point they don't need any additional support making alterations or discussing how this may adapt with anticipated changes in their situation or anything along those lines. So similar to our check-in for information gathering, before we move on to our group discussion, I just kind of want to take a moment to check in with you all. I know that was a lot of information. I think Alyssa and Steph both mentioned you will have access to all of these slides moving forward. Um, so if you need to reference any of that information, you will receive that via email. But for now, are there any questions or concepts that you have regarding building an economic safety plan or discussing options for working towards economic safety with clients? And does anyone have any thoughts or ideas that came up during our exploration of steps towards economic safety that you would like to share? And those can be questions or just like things that came up that you're like, oh, I did that and that worked really well. Or I have a survivor who's working on this right now and it's been really beneficial.
Hi, my name's Becca. I put this in the chat box,
Yeah.
but so one of the things that I've suggested in the past that's been kind of like takes the heat off of the survivor and kind of allows that if they don't have access to the bank account, but they're the one that does all the shopping, like grocery shopping and things like that. I encourage them to get like cash back every time that they go shopping and stash that cash back away so that they can build kind of like an egg's nest or or a nest egg. So that way they have a backup plan in the event that something does happen. Especially like what we've been talking about, they don't have access to their bank account. If they have no idea what kind of financial situation is going on, it can be super helpful, and then it makes the person in control be less questionable because they're like, oh, okay, it's from the store.
Yeah.
So they're not questioning like where's this money coming from because it's on the receipt. So but yeah, that's just a little like tip or trick that seems to not get caught that I have suggested to some people that are in like very high risk um, because they can't just leave. And it's so easy to be like, we'll just leave. And a lot of times they can't, especially if they have like three kids and they're a stay-at-home mom. So, and the stay-at-home moms are usually the ones that do all the shopping, take the kids around and stuff like that. So I'm like, okay, you have the debit card, go get cash back every time you swipe it. So that seems to be really helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's an awesome tip that you mentioned. And like you said, a lot of people don't have the option of leaving their situation or leaving that person. And a lot of these ways are things that are in areas that are being surveyed by another person or in areas that do pose a safety risk. So I think that's an awesome tip to explore with survivors. And I mean, like you said, this person is something that, or this person is someone who decided that that is a safe option for them that makes them feel more financially secure in a way that doesn't pose as much risk to them and to their shared children. Um, and I think that's amazing. I think presenting creative options that either you come up with or other amazing advocates recommend and exploring with survivors, does this feel like it could be an option for you is always beneficial. At the end of the day, they're the expert of their situation and what is going to be safe or unsafe for them. And I think it's awesome that you found something that does make them feel like they're able to build that security while also maintaining their safety, because ultimately, like, that is the goal.
Right, exactly. And it's like way less scary. I'm like, just start out with $5.
Exactly.
$5 is nothing. And if they don't notice it, then keep increasing it. Do like $20 every time. And then before you know it, like you'll have, 500 bucks or something like that and stash it away. Put it in a savings account because that way it'll build up money or something. So, and then start stashing away the paperwork, just small things like that. So, and exactly like everything you said. And I actually learned a lot of things. There's a lot of really good domestic violence groups on Facebook. So I've learned a lot of cool tips and tricks, but that's one that I've noticed that really, really works like most of the time. That seems way less scary for the survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. And I also never even thought about Facebook groups. That's another amazing resource, to be able to connect with advocates across the country or across the world and learn from their advocacy practices, learn about, what people are doing in different types of communities. I know I went to a conference and I was talking to someone who was doing advocacy in a major tourist dependent town. So the town itself, I think, had one bank, maybe two grocery stores, if not just one, and everyone knew everyone. So,
Oh, geez.
yeah, like their advocacy looks entirely different from what I was used to. But
Right,
those communities exist here too. And those communities and those experiences are things that a survivor may come to our organizations and may be facing similar issues. So having an opportunity, like you said, to just, brainstorm with other advocates or just like take an observation role and see what other advocates are doing in their communities is always, beneficial and I think only offers learning opportunities. And, worst scenario, it's an idea that you present and it doesn't, for them, it doesn't feel safe. Or they're like, I don't feel comfortable doing that, which is fine. You
right.
find another creative solution, and that's the key to, I think, effective advocacy.
Yep,
So I think
collaborating.
that's great. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate that.
No, absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay. So it looks like someone had a survivor reach out looking for legal services. Is there anything that we can help with? Yeah, so we'll talk about SALI services specifically. That's going to be the service that I'm most familiar with, but also we'll talk about other ways that we can connect with other legal providers throughout the state that offer different services and kind of what Sally covers versus who we might be able to refer out to as well. Um, and Carmen made a great point as well. Like I mentioned in our presentation, there, for example, if there is a level of surveillance taking place, there are always going to be risks that if a survivor decides to start saving money, the possibility of an abusive partner finding out about that exists, and that's scary. So discussing the risks with that person and exploring, is this something that they want to do? And is that something that makes sense for them? Um, and having a plan in place where if that does take place, how can we best prepare you to navigate that possibility? That's always an important facet to that. You're absolutely welcome. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. This is such an engaging group that makes me so happy. Um, all right, so moving on. So, to kind of initiate the process of collaborating with one another, you all have already done an outstanding job doing that. So, um, amazing. And just generally kind of like learning from the advocates working alongside us. We just kind of wanted to wrap up this section by asking you all a few questions just relating to your experiences working to build economic empowerment for survivors. So, for the next few questions, as with the other discussions that we already did, you can come off mute if that's something you're comfortable with. You can also raise your hand in like the actions tab, or you can also just post it in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much. Um, so how have you begun the conversation surrounding financial needs, and how have you all used that to create a plan of action? So, what are things that have felt effective in navigating that space? What has felt natural navigating that space? Um, and how have you kind of approached breaching into that topic of finances and financial safety? You start the discussion in your initial evaluation. That's awesome. I think that's a great place to start. For me, like I said, everyone's intake process looks different. So I can only speak to my experience. For me, that's somewhere that it felt most natural to kind of fit it in there, even if it was just an initial question. That way we had a point where, we had at least presented the topic, presented the possibility of discussing it further. I'm able to kind of gauge how survivors feel about navigating that conversation. That way I can make informed decisions about how to approach further discussion in that area. Um, some people it doesn't make sense to fit into that initial intake if they're dealing with, emergency situations or gathering incredibly urgent information right off the bat, but you can always figure out what works best for you. Sometimes it is trial and error, and sometimes you're like, "Ooh, this really doesn't fit in naturally here," which is completely okay. We just kind of have to learn from our conversations with survivors and also listen to survivors. If there's a reaction to presenting that information or that conversation a specific way, just kind of reflecting and understanding, okay, why is this not landing the way that we want it to? Why are we not, seeing effective results in brainstorming with survivors in this area? Um, and listening and, taking any feedback that you're getting under consideration is always helpful as well. Wonderful. Sorry, I'm trying to read these chats real quick. Um, Yeah, absolutely. So, Danielle mentioned kind of depending on the circumstances, they will discuss some common barriers, just kind of opening the door for that conversation and kind of gauging how to continue that conversation based on the survivor's response. Um, Absolutely. I think prefacing questions can be really helpful. Um, I found that just kind of like diving right into questions can kind of feel like an interrogation, especially if someone is not expecting it or not comfortable discussing their finances. I think that it can make people feel really put on the spot. So even if it's just like a quick sentence about why we talk about this, I think it can change that dynamic a lot to feel like there's nothing you've said that is making me think one thing or another about your situation. This is just a possibility that exists, and I want to be sure that I'm advocating for you in the best possible way, in the way that makes the most sense and is addressing your specific situation. I think recognizing and telling them that I know this may be uncomfortable to talk about. Absolutely. I agree. Um, Also, just like naturally acknowledging, like Max said, any hesitancy or reluctance that comes with that conversation. You know, we're all human and we all are uncomfortable with different conversation topics, and that's okay. And acknowledging, like, I know that this can feel a little invasive if you're not comfortable sharing. That's completely okay. I ask these questions because of X, Y, and Z. So I just want to be sure we're addressing, this if it's a concern for you. Amazing. Um, Perfect. Yeah, please feel free to keep sending your thoughts, your input in the chat as well. I am going to move on to our next slide just to be sure that we don't get caught up on time. Wonderful. Yes, so our next question was, what resources have you used or organizations have you referred a survivor to in Maryland that you felt were helpful and effective, or you've heard were helpful or effective? Um, Again, feel free to unmute or send in the chat. I find this question to be really helpful, especially if we're able to get the perspective of survivors working with those organizations, just because I think knowing that a survivor in a certain situation was able to get specific resources, felt comfortable getting specific resources with different agencies, to me, I think ensures that we're sending folks to areas that we know survivors feel safe. We know survivors are being listened to and heard and their needs are being addressed beyond just like us knowing that that resource exists in the community and um, you know, feeling like it's an effective organization, having survivors tell us what is working and what isn't working for them allows us to make those more tailored referrals and things like that. Human services program for energy assistance, vouchers, etc. Food banks in our area as well as Carroll County. Catholic Charities, DSS, food and clothing banks. Absolutely. Those are awesome. An amazing caseworker at the health department that helps us apply people for Medicaid. That's amazing. Oh my gosh. Debt bondage relief and criminal record options for human trafficking survivors. I believe the Human Trafficking Prevention Project does a lot of work in that area. Wonderful. That's amazing. While you all continue sending resources, I wanted to mention another great resource. We have the information listed on the next slide. Is going to be Maryland 211. So, whether you are offering their information to survivors or using it yourself, once you've kind of discussed what resources may be helpful to the client, you can call or visit their website for access to an array of community organizations that you might be unaware of. Um, and this can help establish a more well-rounded community support network, like we talked about, for survivors who are just generally seeking or generally looking for information on things like victim services, legal services, resources for folks experiencing homelessness, shelters and housing assistance, departments of human services, mental health providers, campus health centers, substance use treatment centers and recovery programs. Even if it's just like when I was doing direct service work, if I saw a need or a concern arising, I would try to brainstorm like, okay, who might be able to address this concern that we keep seeing come up? And just like reaching out to them, even if I didn't have a survivor that was specifically looking for that at the moment, just to see if you can get a point of contact to kind of talk through, okay, what do your services actually look like? Do I have an accurate understanding of what you're able to offer and what you're not able to offer? Just kind of proactively building those connections, I think can make in the moment referrals a lot easier and just help build confidence about your understanding of what exists in the community. All right, and then I think this is my last slide. So you won't have to listen to me ramble on much longer, I promise. There are a myriad of financial legal remedies, depending on the facts of the situation. So I just wanted to offer Sally's information and a little brief rundown about just kind of what we offer and what advocates versus attorneys are able to offer. So Sally's advocates can help with financial safety planning, and the attorneys can help offer either legal consultations, or just help identify what legal remedies may be relevant for the survivor. So, just as kind of a general outline of what areas SALI practices in, there are areas of criminal legal advocacy, so advocating for the rights of crime victims. And those areas can include things like health matters, so like requesting and receiving results of HIV or Hep C testing, safety matters like setting release conditions, privacy, maybe requesting contact or other personal information to remain confidential, and financial options. That can be things like submitting claims through the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board or the CICB, pursuing a claim through them. And then also civil services, so things like peace and protective orders, privacy matters, housing matters. I believe Steph mentioned this at the beginning of the PowerPoint with the termination of a lease. Employment law matters, whether that's sexual harassment, disability benefits, or the Family Medical Leave Act. Primary and secondary school issues or Title IX proceedings. Immigration matters, and those include VAWA self-petitions, U visas, and T visas. And then family law matters like divorce and custody. We can offer referrals for tort cases, and then also our advocates and attorneys are able to help with safety planning as well. And then any areas where it may not be a service that we're directly providing, or if there's a situation that comes up that falls outside of like how we're able to assist, we're always happy to brainstorm other community organizations that may be able to offer assistance. Steph, did you want to chime in here?
No, it's just getting ready for the next slide. This is great.
Amazing. You're so prepared. Well, yeah, with that, I will transfer it over to Steph. If you have any questions, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and offer any information I can. But I will hand it off to you, Steph.
Yeah, thanks so much, Claire. That was excellent. And thank you all for your participation and your suggestions and sharing your knowledge with the group as well. So our last slide is just to give you an additional resource that MCASA has. So about a year and a half ago, we did a Lunch and Learn series specifically on money and kind of the law and some legal resources for survivors. So this is on MCASA's YouTube channel. So if you are an attorney yourself or a legal advocate, or you work with folks that are seeking some civil or criminal legal services, this may be really helpful for you to dig into a little bit of what Claire said in the last slide. So please take advantage of that. That's free. It's on our website at all times, so you can do it at your own pace, or you can kind of pick and choose from these 4 topics, which might be the most relevant to you. So with that, I'm going to post our contact information and turn it back over to Alyssa. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Steph, and thank you, Claire, for this wonderful presentation. So I posted in the chat the anonymous evaluation link. Again, we greatly appreciate all feedback as we're constantly striving to improve. And if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for social work CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. If you click on that link, it will take you to the certificate request form. You can expect to receive your certificates by email in 3 to 4 weeks. I will be sending out a follow-up email later today with a copy of the PowerPoint slides, the video recording, as well as the links to the Money Matters Lunch and Learn series that Stephanie was just talking about. And I'll be sending out the evaluation link as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to email us, or you can respond to the follow-up email later. So thank you again for coming today, and we hope to see you tomorrow.